The rusty Bell UH-1 Huey sat in the corner of Hangar 7 like a forgotten relic, its faded olive drab paint chipped and scarred from decades of service. Most pilots at Riverside Medical Center gave it a wide berth, whispering jokes about the flying Coffin and its stubborn pilot who refused to give up on the aging aircraft. They had no idea that this battered helicopter and the woman who flew it would soon become the difference between life and death for dozens of people across the Pacific Northwest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog clung to the Columbia River Valley like a gray blanket as Captain Sarah Mitchell completed her pre-flight inspection of the 30-year-old Huey. Her weathered hands moved with practiced precision across every bolt, wire, and hydraulic line, checking systems that most modern pilots had never seen. The helicopter's age showed in every rivet and panel, but Sarah knew this machine better than she knew herself. "Still talking to that old bird, Mitchell?" called out Dr. James Harrison as he crossed the tarmac toward the gleaming new Eurocopter EC-145, parked in the prime spot near the medical center's helipad. His tone carried the familiar mixture of amusement and condescension she'd grown accustomed to over the past 5 years. "You know, they make helicopters with actual working air conditioning now." Sarah glanced up from the engine compartment, her grease-stained coveralls a stark contrast to Harrison's pristine flight suit. "She's got more flight hours than your fancy European toy will ever see," she replied, not bothering to hide the edge in her voice. "And she's never left anyone stranded." Harrison laughed, shaking his head as he continued toward his aircraft. "Whatever helps you sleep at night. Just try to keep up today, will you?" The exchange was typical of her daily interactions at Riverside Medical Center's flight operations. As the senior pilot for the Emergency Medical Services Division, Sarah should have commanded respect from her colleagues. Instead, she found herself defending both her aircraft and her methods to pilots who saw her 30-year-old Huey as an embarrassment to the modern fleet. The truth was more complicated than her critics understood. Sarah Mitchell hadn't chosen the old Huey out of nostalgia or stubbornness. She'd inherited it 5 years ago when she'd arrived at Riverside, fresh from a career-ending scandal that had destroyed her reputation as one of the military's most promising test pilots. The Huey had been scheduled for decommission, deemed too old and unreliable for critical medical missions. But Sarah had seen something in the aging aircraft that others missed. She'd spent her first year at Riverside quietly rebuilding the helicopter from the ground up, sourcing parts from junkyards and military surplus stores, upgrading systems with her own modifications that weren't found in any manual. The other pilots assumed she was wasting time on a hopeless project. What they didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell had learned more about aircraft systems during her military career than most pilots would in a lifetime. "Morning, Captain Mitchell," called out Angela Torres, the chief flight nurse, as she approached with her medical kit. Unlike the pilots, the medical staff had learned to appreciate Sarah's meticulous attention to detail and her uncanny ability to reach patients in conditions that grounded other aircraft. "We've got a call coming in. Hiking accident up on Mount Jefferson, multiple casualties." Sarah nodded, her mind already shifting into mission mode. Mount Jefferson's rugged terrain was notorious for challenging flying conditions with unpredictable wind patterns and limited landing zones. It was the kind of mission that separated experienced pilots from weekend warriors. "Weather report?" Sarah asked, though she'd already been monitoring conditions since dawn. "Marginal," Torres replied, consulting her tablet. "Clouds moving in from the west, winds gusting to 25 knots. Harrison's already said his bird can't handle the mountain conditions today." Sarah wasn't surprised. The EC-145 was an excellent aircraft in ideal conditions, but its computerized systems and lightweight construction made it unsuitable for the Kind of rough terrain flying that mountain rescues demanded. The Huey, despite its age, had been designed for exactly this type of mission. "Load up," Sarah said simply. "We'll be airborne in 10 minutes. As Torres began securing medical equipment in the helicopter's cargo bay, Sarah completed her final systems checks. The Huey's twin-turbine engines came to life with a distinctive whine that had become music to her ears. Unlike the whisper-quiet modern helicopters, the old bird announced its presence with authority. The Flight Operations Center buzzed with activity as Sarah received her mission briefing. A group of experienced hikers had encountered severe weather on Mount Jefferson's north face. Initial reports suggested at least 3 serious injuries, including a possible spinal trauma case. The rescue location was accessible only by helicopter, and the weather window was closing rapidly. "Mitchell," called out Operations Chief Robert Kane as she prepared to depart. "You sure about this? The forecast shows deteriorating conditions over the mountain. Maybe we should wait for the Coast Guard." Sarah checked her instruments one final time. "The Coast Guard's 2 hours out, minimum. These people don't have 2 hours." She looked Kane directly in the eye. "I can get there." Kane hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with sending his most problematic pilot into dangerous conditions with the fleet's oldest aircraft. But he also knew that Sarah Mitchell had never failed to complete a mission, regardless of the obstacles. "Keep us posted," he said finally. "And Mitchell, be careful up there." The Huey lifted off from Riverside's helipad with Torres and paramedic David Chun secured in the cabin. As they climbed toward the mountains, Sarah felt the familiar transformation that occurred whenever she took the controls. On the ground, she was the outcast pilot with the ancient helicopter. In the air, she was exactly where she belonged. The flight to Mount Jefferson took them over the scenic Columbia River Gorge, with its dramatic cliffs and cascading waterfalls. But Sarah's attention was focused on the weather patterns developing ahead. Dark clouds were building over the peaks, and the wind readings on her instruments showed the kind of turbulence that could turn a routine mission into a nightmare. "How's our old girl handling it?" Torres asked over the intercom, noting the helicopter's steady performance despite the challenging conditions. "Like she was born for this," Sarah replied, making subtle adjustments to compensate for the increasing wind shear. The Huey's mechanical controls gave her a direct connection to the aircraft that modern fly-by-wire systems couldn't match. She could feel every air current, every shift in wind direction through the control stick. As they approached the search area, the terrain became increasingly hostile. Mount Jefferson's volcanic peaks jutted skyward like ancient teeth, their slopes covered in loose scree and dense forest. Finding the injured hikers in this wilderness would require both skill and luck. "There," Chun called out, pointing toward a small clearing on a narrow ridge. "I can see orange fabric. Looks like an emergency shelter." Sarah banked the Huey toward the location, immediately recognizing the challenges it presented. The landing zone was barely large enough for the helicopter, with steep drop-offs on 3 sides and tall trees creating dangerous wind patterns. It was exactly the kind of approach that had killed pilots in less capable aircraft. "This is going to be tight," she warned her crew as she began the approach. "Stay strapped in until I give the all clear." The Huey descended through swirling air currents, its rotor blades coming within feet of the surrounding trees. Sarah's hands worked the controls with surgical precision, making constant micro-adjustments to keep the aircraft stable in the turbulent air. This was the kind of flying that couldn't be taught in a classroom or simulator. It required instinct, experience, and absolute trust in both machine and pilot. As the Huey skids touched the rocky ground, Sarah immediately recognized that this was just the beginning of their challenges. The weather was deteriorating faster than predicted, and the injured hikers would need to be evacuated quickly. But first, they had to reach them. The rescue site was 100 yards down a treacherous slope from the landing zone. Torres and Chun would have to rappel down to reach the casualties, then coordinate a complex extraction using the helicopter rescue hoist. It was dangerous work made more challenging by the worsening weather conditions. "Wind's picking up," Torres observed as she prepared her rappelling gear. "How long can you hold the position?" Sarah checked her instruments and scanned the sky. The clouds were lowering rapidly, and she could see rain squalls moving across the adjacent peaks. In another hour, this entire area would be soaked in with zero visibility. "As long as it takes," she said simply. What her crew didn't know was that Sarah had faced similar conditions before, in places where failure meant death for herself and her team. The memories of those missions, both successful and catastrophic, drove her to maintain impossibly high standards for both her aircraft and her flying skills. As Torres and Chun descended toward the injured hikers, Sarah kept the Huey in a precise hover, compensating for wind gusts that would have overwhelmed a less experienced pilot. The old helicopter responded to her commands like an extension of her own body, its mechanical systems providing the kind of direct control that modern computerized aircraft couldn't match. Through her headset, she could hear the medical team's progress reports. 3 hikers with varying degrees of injury, including one with a suspected spinal fracture that would require extreme care during evacuation. The kind of mission that demanded both technical precision and split-second decision-making. "Sarah," Torres's voice crackled through the radio. "We're going to need the basket for the spinal injury. Can you position for a hoist extraction?" Sarah had been anticipating this request. The rescue basket would allow them to evacuate the most seriously injured hiker while maintaining spinal immobilization, but it would require her to hold the Huey in an even more challenging hover while the basket was lowered and raised. "Copy that," she replied, already beginning the delicate maneuver that would position the helicopter directly over the rescue site. The next 30 minutes tested every skill Sarah had acquired during her military career. The wind continued to intensify, creating downdrafts and turbulence that threatened to slam the helicopter into the mountainside. But the old Huey held steady, its powerful engines and robust construction proving their worth in conditions that would have grounded newer, more sophisticated aircraft. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. One by one, the injured hikers were hoisted to safety. Sarah maintained her position with mechanical precision, her concentration absolute despite the physical strain of fighting the controls in the deteriorating weather. This was what she lived for, the moment when skill, experience, and determination combined to snatch victory from the jaws of disaster. As the last hiker was secured in the helicopter's cabin, Sarah began the complex process of departing from the confined landing zone. The clouds had dropped to just above the peaks, creating a maze of gray vapor that obscured landmarks and navigation references. Flying by instruments alone, she guided the Huey through the mountain passes toward the safety of lower altitude. "Outstanding work, Captain," Torres said as they cleared the worst of the weather. "I don't think any other pilot could have pulled that off." Sarah didn't respond immediately, her attention focused on the flight back to Riverside. But privately, she felt a familiar satisfaction that came from pushing both herself and her aircraft to their limits and succeeding where others might have failed. The landing at Riverside Medical Center was routine compared to the mountain rescue. But Sarah could see the surprised faces of ground personnel as the battered Huey touched down with its cargo of rescued hikers. Word of the successful mission would spread quickly through the facility, though she knew it would do little to change most people's opinions about her or her aircraft. As the medical team rushed the injured hikers into the hospital, Sarah began her post-flight inspection of the Huey. The helicopter had performed flawlessly during the demanding mission, its systems functioning exactly as she'd rebuilt them to do. But she also knew that each flight in harsh conditions took a toll on them. Aging aircraft. "Hell of a job up there, Mitchell," called out Kane as he approached the helicopter. The weather station confirmed winds over 40 knots on the mountain. Most pilots would have turned back. Sarah looked up from checking the main rotor head, her hands already identifying minor issues that would need attention before the next flight. "Most pilots don't understand their aircraft well enough to know what's possible," she replied. Kane studied her for a moment, perhaps recognizing that there was more to Sarah Mitchell than her colleagues realized. "The hospital boards. Been asking questions about the fleet again. Budget pressures, you know. Some people think we should retire the older aircraft." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knew that her Huey was constantly under scrutiny, viewed by administrators as an expensive liability rather than a life-saving asset. The fact that it had just completed a mission that no other aircraft in the fleet could have handled seemed irrelevant to those who saw only maintenance costs and insurance premiums. "They're welcome to try," Sarah said, returning to her inspection. "But when the next impossible mission comes up, they'll be calling this old bird again." As evening fell over the Columbia River Valley, Sarah completed her maintenance routine with the same methodical precision she brought to every aspect of her flying. The Huey sat quietly in its corner of the hangar, ready for whatever emergency might arise during the night. To most people, it remained just an aging helicopter piloted by a stubborn woman who refused to embrace progress. But Sarah Mitchell knew better. She understood that reliability wasn't measured in computer screens and digital displays, but in the ability to complete missions when everything else failed. And despite what her critics believed, she and her flying Coffin were just getting started. 3 weeks after the Mount Jefferson rescue, Sarah Mitchell found herself standing before a review board in the sterile conference room of Riverside Medical Center's administrative wing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as 5 administrators in pressed suits examined maintenance reports and cost analyses spread across the polished table. None of them had ever set foot in a helicopter, yet they held the power to ground her permanently. "Captain Mitchell," began Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, the hospital's chief financial officer, her voice carrying the cold efficiency of someone who saw aircraft as line items on a budget sheet. "Your helicopter has the highest maintenance costs in our fleet. The parts alone for your Bell UH-1 exceed the operating expenses of our 2 EC-145s combined." Sarah remained standing at attention, her hands clasped behind her back in a pose that betrayed her military background. She'd been through similar interrogations before, though the consequences this time felt more personal. "The Huey's parts are sourced differently than modern aircraft," she replied evenly. "Many components are rebuilt rather than replaced, which requires more labor, but significantly reduces material costs." Board member Gerald Phillips, a bean counter who'd never worked outside an office, shuffled through his papers with obvious irritation. "Labor is expensive, Captain. Our insurance company has also expressed concerns about operating such an old aircraft for critical missions. They're recommending we phase out anything manufactured before 1990. The recommendation hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah knew this meeting had been inevitable since her arrival at Riverside. Hospital administrators viewed her Huey as a relic from a bygone era, unsuitable for modern medical operations. They saw only numbers on spreadsheets, not the lives that had been saved by her supposedly obsolete aircraft. "With respect," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully, "that helicopter has a perfect mission completion rate over 5 years of operation. 0 mechanical failures, 0 weather-related delays, 0 patient transport incidents. Can the modern fleet make the same claim?" Dr. Hartman consulted her tablet, clearly uncomfortable with the statistics. The truth was that Sarah's old Huey had outperformed every other aircraft in the fleet by virtually every metric that mattered. But reliability didn't offset the political pressure to modernize and reduce insurance liability. "Your safety record is commendable," admitted Thomas Chun, the hospital's legal counsel. However, we must consider future risk exposure. What happens when critical parts become unavailable? What happens when your expertise is no longer available to maintain such a specialized aircraft? The question struck closer to home than Chun realized. Sarah was the only pilot at Riverside qualified to fly the Huey in extreme conditions, and she was also the only person capable of maintaining its unique modifications. She'd created a situation where the helicopter was entirely dependent on her presence, which made administrators nervous about long-term viability. "I've documented all modifications and maintenance procedures," Sarah replied. Any qualified aircraft mechanic could maintain the system with proper training. But even as she said it, Sarah knew the argument was weak. The truth was that her relationship with the Huey went far beyond standard operating procedures. She'd rebuilt the aircraft from the ground up using techniques learned during her military career, creating a machine that existed nowhere else in the world. It was as much a reflection of her personality as it was a tool for saving lives. The meeting continued for another hour, with Sarah defending every aspect of her operation against a steady barrage of financial and legal objections. The board members had clearly made their decision before she'd entered the room. This was merely a formality, a paper trail to justify retiring the helicopter and potentially her position as well. "We'll take your comments under advisement," Dr. Hartman said finally. "A decision will be made within 30 days. In the meantime, we're implementing additional oversight procedures for your aircraft operations." Sarah nodded stiffly and left the conference room, knowing she'd just witnessed the beginning of the end for her flying career at Riverside. As she walked through the hospital corridors toward the Flight Operations Center, she passed bulletin boards covered with news clippings about recent successful rescues, many of them accomplished by her supposedly obsolete helicopter. That the irony wasn't lost on her. 5 years ago, she'd arrived at Riverside as damaged goods, a former military test pilot whose career had been destroyed by a single catastrophic mistake. The hospital had offered her a chance to rebuild her life, though they'd never imagined she would literally rebuild an aircraft in the process. Now that same helicopter was being targeted for elimination by people who'd never experienced the life or death decisions that defined emergency aviation. "Rough meeting?" asked Angela Torres as Sarah entered the Flight Operations Center. The chief flight nurse had developed an uncanny ability to read Sarah's mood, probably from years of working together in high-stress situations. "They're moving forward with fleet modernization," Sarah replied, settling into her desk chair with obvious fatigue. 30 days to make their case for keeping the Huey operational. Torres frowned, understanding the implications immediately. "That's insane. Your bird has saved more lives than any other aircraft in the fleet. Just last month, you evacuated those firefighters from the forest fire when everyone else was grounded by smoke." The forest fire incident had been another example of the Huey's capabilities exceeding those of modern aircraft. When thick smoke had reduced visibility to near zero, Sarah's helicopter had been the only one capable of operating in the hazardous conditions. Its robust construction and analog instruments made it ideal for flying when electronic systems failed or became unreliable. "Statistics don't matter when insurance companies get nervous," Sarah said, pulling up maintenance schedules on her computer. "They see an old aircraft and assume it's unsafe, regardless of actual performance data." What Sarah didn't tell Torres was that the review board's decision might actually be a relief. For 5 years, she'd been living with the constant pressure of proving herself worthy of a second chance. The Huey had become both her redemption and her prison, a symbol of her determination to overcome past failures while simultaneously reminding her of everything she'd lost. The truth about Sarah Mitchell's military career was more complicated than her colleagues at Riverside understood. She hadn't been just another test pilot. She'd been part of an elite program developing next-generation helicopter technology for special operations. Her work had pushed the boundaries of what was possible with rotorcraft design, creating aircraft that could operate in conditions that would destroy conventional helicopters. But success in experimental aviation required taking risks that occasionally ended in disaster. Sarah's downfall had come during the test flight of a revolutionary new helicopter design, an aircraft that promised to revolutionize military aviation. She'd been pushing the envelope, testing the limits of the new technology, when a catastrophic system failure had resulted in a crash that killed her co-pilot and destroyed millions of dollars in prototype equipment. The subsequent investigation had cleared her of pilot error, but the political fallout had been devastating. The experimental program was canceled, careers were destroyed, and Sarah found herself blacklisted from military aviation despite her exemplary record. The woman who had once been on track to become one of the youngest test pilot commanders in Air Force history was suddenly unemployable in her chosen field. Riverside Medical Center had offered her a lifeline, though not without conditions. She would fly medical missions under strict supervision, operating aircraft that were considered safe and reliable by conventional standards. There would be no more experimental flying, no more pushing technological boundaries, no more risk-taking. That could endanger lives or careers, but Sarah had found it impossible to completely suppress her innovative instincts. The Huey had become her canvas for channeling the same creativity that had made her a successful test pilot. She'd modified its systems, improved its performance, and transformed it into something unique in the world of medical aviation. In a way, she'd created her own experimental aircraft program, hidden within the mundane world of hospital operations. "Captain Mitchell," called out David Chun as he approached her desk. "We've got an urgent call coming in. Multi-vehicle accident. On Highway 26, near Government Camp. Multiple casualties, limited access for ground vehicles." Sarah immediately shifted into mission mode, her personal problems temporarily forgotten. Highway 26 near Government Camp was notorious for winter accidents, particularly during periods of changing weather when road conditions could deteriorate rapidly. The location was challenging for helicopter operations, with high altitude, unpredictable winds, and limited landing options. "Weather status?" she asked, already pulling up current conditions on her computer. "Marginal," Chun replied. "Ceiling at 1,500 feet, light snow, winds variable. Harrison's EC-145 is down for scheduled maintenance, so you're the primary response." Sarah felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as she prepared for another challenging mission. The Huey might be under administrative review, but it was still the only aircraft available for this critical response. She gathered her flight gear and headed toward the hangar, knowing that the next few hours could provide either vindication or ammunition for her critics. The accident scene on Highway 26 was worse than the initial reports had suggested. A chain reaction. Collision involving 6 vehicles had created a debris field spanning both lanes of the mountain highway. Emergency responders were working to extract trapped victims, but the remote location made it impossible for ground ambulances to reach the most seriously injured patients quickly enough. Sarah brought the Huey in low over the accident scene, immediately recognizing the tactical challenges involved. The highway was too narrow for a safe landing, with power lines on one side and steep terrain on the other. She would need to use her external rescue hoist to evacuate patients, requiring precise hovering in conditions that were becoming increasingly difficult as the weather deteriorated. "Life Flight Base, this is Mitchell," she radioed to the operations center. "I have a visual of the accident scene. Requesting clearance for hoist operations. Be advised, conditions are marginal and deteriorating." "Copy that, Mitchell. You're cleared for rescue operations. Multiple agencies are coordinating ground response, but helicopter evacuation is critical for the most serious casualties." "For the next 2 hours," Sarah demonstrated exactly why the Huey had earned its reputation as an unstoppable force in emergency medicine. Working with Torres and Chun, she evacuated 7 critically injured patients from the accident scene, each extraction requiring a different approach as weather conditions continued to worsen. The old helicopters, mechanical flight controls allowed Sarah to maintain precise positioning despite gusting winds that would have overwhelmed computerized systems. Its powerful engines provided the lifting capacity needed to operate the rescue hoist while maintaining stable flight, and its robust construction absorbed the punishment of prolonged hovering in turbulent air. "That's the last critical patient," Torres announced as they completed the final hoist operation. "Ground units can handle the remaining casualties." Sarah acknowledged and began the flight back to Riverside, her mind already processing the lessons learned from another successful mission. The Huey had once again proven its worth under conditions that would have challenged any aircraft in their fleet. Yet she knew that administrative concerns would continue to overshadow operational success. As they approached the medical center's helipad, Sarah could see Dr. Hartman and other board members watching from the administrative building's windows. Word of the highway accident response had obviously reached them quickly, creating an awkward situation where they were witnessing the capabilities of an aircraft they were planning to retire. "Outstanding work today, Captain," Kane said as Sarah completed her post-flight procedures. 7 lives saved because we had the right aircraft and the right pilot available. The State Patrol commander specifically requested a commendation for your crew." Sarah nodded her appreciation but knew that commendations wouldn't influence budget decisions. The Huey's fate would be determined by insurance actuaries and financial projectors, not by the people whose lives it had saved. She'd learned long ago that heroic actions were quickly forgotten when they conflicted with institutional priorities. That evening, as Sarah performed her routine maintenance inspection of the Huey, she reflected on the strange trajectory her career had taken. 5 years ago, she'd been designing aircraft that pushed the boundaries of physics and engineering. Now she was fighting to keep a 30-year-old helicopter operational against the objections of hospital administrators who saw it as an expensive liability, but perhaps that was exactly where she belonged. The Huey represented everything she'd learned about aviation over 2 decades of flying, from basic mechanical principles to advanced aerodynamic theory. It was simultaneously primitive and sophisticated, combining proven technology with innovative modifications that existed nowhere else in the world. "Working late again?" asked Torres as she entered the hangar to retrieve equipment from the helicopter. "Just checking a few things," Sarah replied, though they both knew she was really saying goodbye to another day of flying an aircraft that might soon be taken away from her. "For what it's worth," Torres said, "I've never felt safer in any aircraft than I do in this old bird. There's something about the way you fly her that makes even the impossible missions feel routine." Sarah appreciated the sentiment, though she knew that confidence was built on years of experience that couldn't be easily transferred to another pilot or aircraft. The Huey wasn't just a machine. It was an extension of her own capabilities, modified and refined until it perfectly matched her flying style and operational philosophy. As Torres left the hangar, Sarah continued her inspection in solitude, her hands moving automatically across familiar surfaces while her mind grappled with an uncertain future. Tomorrow would bring new emergencies, new challenges, and new opportunities. To prove that age and technology weren't always synonymous with capability, but it would also bring her one day closer to a decision that could end her flying career forever. The woman who had once designed the future of military aviation was now fighting to preserve the past, defending a helicopter that represented everything the modern world had left behind, in the silence of the hangar, surrounded by the tools and spare parts that kept her flying Coffin operational. Sarah Mitchell prepared for the battle of her professional life. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November. jolting Sarah awake from the fitful sleep that had become her norm since the administrative review began. Her phone's harsh ring cut through the darkness of her small apartment overlooking the Columbia River, and she answered on the second ring, already reaching for her flight suit. "Captain Mitchell, this is dispatch," came the voice of Nancy Williams, the night shift coordinator. "We have a code red emergency. Pediatric trauma at Children's Hospital needs immediate transport to Portland General for emergency surgery. Patient is a 6-year-old girl, critical condition, requires specialized neurosurgical intervention." Sarah was already pulling on her boots as Williams continued the briefing. Children's Hospital of Portland was only 12 minutes away by helicopter. But Portland General's trauma center was across the city in conditions that would challenge any aircraft. More importantly, this wasn't just another medical transport. It was exactly the kind of mission that would be impossible if the Huey were retired. "Weather status?" Sarah asked, stepping onto her apartment balcony to assess conditions firsthand. The Columbia River Valley was shrouded in thick fog, the kind of zero-visibility weather that grounded most aircraft and turned routine flights into exercises in pure instrument flying. "Fog bank extending from sea level to 800 feet, Williams replied. "Visibility less than 1/4 mile citywide. The other birds are grounded until it clears." Sarah felt a familiar surge of determination mixed with grim satisfaction. This was exactly why she'd spent 5 years perfecting the Huey's instrument systems and training for low-visibility operations. While other pilots waited for perfect conditions, she'd learned to fly when flying seemed impossible. 20 minutes later, Sarah was pre-flighting the Huey in a hangar filled with fog so thick she could barely see the helicopter's tail rotor. Angela Torres arrived with Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the pediatric trauma specialist who would accompany them on the critical transport. Both women looked tense, understanding the stakes involved in moving a critically injured child through conditions that had grounded the rest of the fleet. "How bad is it out there?" Dr. Martinez asked as she secured her medical equipment in the helicopter's cabin. "Bad enough," Sarah replied, running through her pre-flight checklist with extra care. "We'll be flying entirely on instruments until we reach altitude. No visual references, no margin for error." What she didn't mention was that this type of flying represented the absolute pinnacle of helicopter piloting skills. Unlike fixed-wing aircraft that could rely on autopilot systems and established flight paths, helicopters required constant manual input from the pilot. Flying in zero visibility meant trusting instruments completely while making thousands of tiny adjustments to keep the aircraft stable and on course. The flight to Children's Hospital took them through fog so dense that Sarah couldn't see beyond the helicopter's nose. She navigated using a combination of GPS, radar altimeter, and dead reckoning, skills she'd learned during her military career and refined through years of challenging civilian missions. The Huey responded to her commands with mechanical precision, its analog instruments providing reliable feedback even when modern glass cockpits might fail. At Children's Hospital, the patient transfer took place in an atmosphere of controlled urgency. The 6-year-old girl, Emma Nakamura, had suffered severe head trauma in a playground accident. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly, and the specialized neurosurgical team at Portland General represented her only chance for survival. "She's barely holding on," Dr. Martinez explained as they secured the tiny patient in the helicopter's medical bay. "We need to get her to surgery within 30 minutes, or we're going to lose her." Sarah nodded grimly and lifted off into the fog-shrouded night. The flight to Portland General would take them across the most congested airspace in Oregon, through areas where instrument approaches required split-second timing and absolute precision. It was the kind of mission that separated true professionals from pilots who simply flew helicopters for a living. As they climbed through the fog layer, Sarah's radio crackled with concerned voices from air traffic control. "Life Flight 19. Be advised you're the only aircraft operating in the Portland metro area. All other traffic has been grounded due to weather conditions. Copy that, Control, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the pressure. Proceeding. Direct to Portland General with critical patient transport. The flight through Portland's airspace required navigating around radio towers, high-rise buildings, and approach paths for the international airport, all while maintaining precise altitude and heading in zero visibility. Sarah flew the Huey like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, making minute adjustments based on instrument readings and her intuitive understanding of the aircraft's behavior. 2 minutes out from Portland General, she announced to her medical crew. Patient status? Stable but critical, Dr. Martinez replied, monitoring Emma's vital signs with portable equipment. We need to get her to the OR immediately upon landing. The approach to Portland General's helipad was one of the most challenging in the Pacific Northwest, requiring a steep descent between tall buildings with minimal room for error. In clear weather, it was merely difficult. In fog conditions like these, it was nearly impossible for most pilots. Sarah began the approach using only instrument references and her memory of the hospital's layout. The Huey descended through the murky air like a ghost, its rotor noise echoing off invisible buildings, as Sarah made constant corrections to maintain the proper glide path. Life Flight 19, you're approaching minimums, warned the air traffic controller. Recommend executing missed approaches if you don't have visual contact. Sarah continued the descent, knowing that a missed approach could cost Emma Nakamura her life. At decision altitude, she could barely make out the red cross markings on the hospital's helipad through the swirling fog. It was the barest minimum visibility required for landing, but it was enough. The Huey touched down on Portland General's helipad with textbook precision, its skids settling onto the wet asphalt as fog swirled around the rotor disc. Medical teams rushed forward to transfer Emma to surgery, their movements urgent but controlled in the gray half-light of early morning. Outstanding flying, Captain, Dr. Martinez said as they prepared Emma for transport. I've never seen anyone land in conditions like these. Sarah simply nodded, already focused on the return flight to Riverside. But as she watched the medical team disappear into the hospital with their tiny patient, she felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that came from pushing both herself and her aircraft to their absolute limits. The return flight was equally challenging, with fog conditions persisting throughout the Columbia River Valley. Sarah navigated by instrument alone, using techniques that few helicopter pilots had ever mastered. The Huey performed flawlessly, its mechanical systems providing the kind of direct feedback that made precision flying possible, even in impossible conditions. As they approached Riverside Medical Center, Sarah was surprised to see vehicles in the parking lot despite the early hour. Word of the emergency transport had apparently reached the hospital administration, bringing both supporters and critics out to witness another demonstration of the Huey's capabilities. Hell of a piece of flying, Mitchell, said Operations Chief Kane as Sarah completed her post-flight procedures. Portland General called to say Emma's surgery was successful. They specifically mentioned that she wouldn't have made it without the emergency transport. Sarah felt a surge of quiet pride, though she kept her expression neutral. This was why she flew moments when skill and determination combined to save lives that would otherwise be lost. The administrative review, the budget pressures, the insurance concerns all faded into insignificance when measured against a 6-year-old girl's chance at life, but her satisfaction was short-lived. As Sarah secured the Huey in its hangar, Dr. Hartman approached with a grim expression that suggested more bureaucratic challenges ahead. Captain Mitchell, Hartman began, I want to commend you on tonight's mission. However, we've received some concerning communications from our insurance company. Sarah turned to face the administrator, already anticipating another round of financial objections to her continued operations. What kind of concerns? They're questioning whether operating in weather conditions that ground other aircraft represents an acceptable risk profile, Hartman explained. Their actuaries are suggesting that such flights exceed normal safety parameters. The irony was staggering. Sarah had just completed a mission that no other pilot could have accomplished, saving a child's life in the process, and the insurance company's response was to question whether such capabilities were too dangerous to allow. The mission was conducted within established safety protocols, Sarah replied carefully. Weather minimums were observed, and all procedures were followed correctly. I understand that, Hartman said. But our legal department is concerned about liability, exposure if something goes wrong during one of these extreme weather operations. They're recommending that we establish more conservative flight guidelines. Sarah knew exactly what more conservative flight guidelines meant: grounding the Huey whenever conditions became challenging, eliminating its primary advantage over the modern fleet. It was killed by 1,000 cuts, a bureaucratic strategy designed to make her helicopter irrelevant without the political cost of direct elimination. Those guidelines would prevent missions like tonight's transport, Sarah pointed out. Emma Nakamura would have died waiting for better weather. That's a tragic possibility, Hartman admitted. But we have to balance individual cases against overall risk management. One accident could expose the hospital to millions in liability claims. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Sarah defending capabilities that had just been proven under the most demanding conditions imaginable. But she could see that administrative momentum was building against her, driven by financial pressures that had nothing to do with actual operational effectiveness. As Hartman left the hangar, Sarah remained with the Huey, running her hands along its scarred fuselage while contemplating an uncertain future. 5 years of proving herself hadn't been enough to overcome institutional resistance to anything that didn't fit neatly into standard operating procedures. "Captain?" called a voice from the hangar entrance. Sarah turned to see Dr. Martinez approaching, still wearing scrubs from Emma's surgery. "How is she?" Sarah asked immediately. "She's going to make it," Martinez replied with a tired smile. "Full recovery expected, thanks to getting her to surgery in time. I wanted to thank you personally. I've been doing pediatric trauma for 15 years, and I've never seen flying like that." Sarah felt a genuine warmth at the news, though her expression remained composed. "Just doing my job, Doctor." "No," Martinez said firmly. "What you did tonight was far beyond anyone's job description. You flew in conditions that should have been impossible, using skills that most pilots don't even know exist." As Martinez left to return to her patients, Sarah was approached by someone she hadn't expected to see, Colonel Frank Williams, her former commanding officer from the experimental helicopter program. Williams had been one of the few military leaders who'd supported her after the test flight disaster, though political pressure had ultimately forced him to distance himself from her situation. "Hello, Sarah," Williams said quietly. "I heard about tonight's mission through some old Air Force contacts at Portland General. Thought I'd drive down to see how you were doing." Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions at seeing her former commander. Williams represented both the pinnacle of her military career and its devastating conclusion, a reminder of everything she'd achieved and everything she'd lost. "Colonel," she replied formally. "I didn't know you were in the area." "Retired now," Williams explained. "Living up in Hood River, trying to learn how to fish." He gestured toward the Huey with obvious admiration. "Heard you've been keeping busy with this old bird." Sarah nodded, unsure how to respond. Williams had been present during the investigation that followed her test flight accident, and his support had been one of the few bright spots during the darkest period of her career. "I've been following your work here," Williams continued. 30 years in the Air Force, and I've never seen anything like what you've accomplished with this helicopter. You've essentially created a one-of-a-kind aircraft using nothing but determination and mechanical genius." "I had good training," Sarah replied simply. Williams smiled at her characteristic understatement. Sarah, what you learned in our program was advanced aerodynamics and experimental systems integration. What you've done here is something entirely different, taking proven technology and pushing it beyond its original design parameters through pure skill and innovation. The conversation that followed revealed how closely Williams had been monitoring Sarah's career at Riverside. Through military contacts and aviation networks, he'd tracked her missions, her safety record, and her ongoing conflicts with hospital administration. "They're going to try to ground you," Williams said bluntly. "I've seen the same pattern before, bureaucrats who don't understand aviation making decisions based on fear and liability concerns." Sarah had suspected as much, though hearing it confirmed by someone with Williams' experience was sobering. "There's not much I can do about administrative decisions." "Maybe there is," Williams replied cryptically. "I've been talking to some people about a new program, private sector emergency services, operating outside traditional hospital systems. Might be interested in a pilot with your particular skills." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline, though Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to abandon everything she'd built at Riverside. The Huey represented 5 years of her life, a tangible symbol of her determination to rebuild after failure. "Think about it," Williams said as he prepared to leave. "People like you don't come along often, Sarah. It would be a shame to waste those skills on bureaucratic politics." As dawn broke over the Columbia River Valley, Sarah stood alone in the hangar with her helicopter, contemplating a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. The successful transport of Emma Nakamura had demonstrated her capabilities beyond any doubt, yet institutional forces continued to gather against her. She'd spent 5 years proving that age and technology weren't always synonymous with obsolescence, that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. But she was beginning to understand that proof wasn't enough when it conflicted with insurance, policies, and budget projections. The woman who had once designed the future of military aviation found herself defending the past against people who saw only liability where she saw capability. And for the first time since arriving at Riverside, Sarah Mitchell began to wonder whether it might be time to look toward a different kind of future. The morning of December 15th dawned crisp and clear. Over the Cascade Mountains, the kind of perfect weather that made flying seem effortless. Sarah Mitchell stood in Hangar 7, running her final pre-flight inspection on the Huey, knowing it might be her last time performing this ritual. The hospital board had scheduled their final decision for that afternoon, and all indications suggested they would vote to retire her helicopter and transfer her to ground-based operations. "Beautiful morning for flying," observed Dr. James Harrison as he passed by with his coffee, heading toward his gleaming EC-145. His tone had changed over the past few weeks, shifting from dismissive to something approaching respect after witnessing Sarah's fog-bound rescue of Emma Nakamura. "Every morning's beautiful for flying," Sarah replied, checking the main rotor head with methodical precision. "Just depends on whether you're brave enough to see it." Harrison paused, studying the woman he'd underestimated for 5 years. "For what it's worth, Mitchell, I think they're making a mistake. Your bird might be old, but it gets the job done when nothing else can." Sarah nodded her acknowledgement, but didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that sympathy from colleagues was often fleeting, especially when institutional pressure mounted. Harrison meant well, but he wouldn't risk his own position to defend her operations. That at 10:30 a.m., the emergency alert that would change everything began with a routine call from Mount Hood National Forest. A guided hiking group had activated an emergency beacon near Crater Rock, one of the most remote and dangerous areas on Oregon's highest peak. Initial reports suggested multiple injuries following an unexpected rockslide, with victims trapped at an elevation above 10,000 feet. "Mitchell, your primary response," announced Operations Chief Kane over the hangar intercom. "Multiple casualties at extreme altitude, weather window closing fast. Wind speeds are increasing, visibility dropping. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as she prepared for what promised to be one of the most challenging missions of her career. Mount Hood's Crater Rock area was notorious among rescue pilots, a moonscape of loose volcanic rock and unpredictable weather patterns that had claimed multiple aircraft over the years. "What's the passenger manifest?" Sarah asked as Torres and Chun loaded medical equipment into the Huey's cabin. 12 hikers total, Kane replied, consulting his tablet. 6 adults, 6 teenagers from a Portland youth program. Guide reports at least 4 serious injuries, including possible spinal trauma and internal bleeding. The stakes were immediately clear. This wasn't just another rescue mission. It was exactly the kind of high-altitude, high-risk operation that showcased both the Huey's unique capabilities and Sarah's extraordinary skills. It was also the kind of mission that would be impossible for any other aircraft in the fleet. "What about the EC-145?" asked Torres as they completed loading procedures. "Harrison's bird doesn't have the power-to-weight ratio for sustained operations above 8,000 feet, Sarah explained. "The Huey's twin engines and modified rotor system give us capabilities that exist nowhere else in the Pacific Northwest." As they lifted off from Riverside Medical Center, Sarah could see hospital administrators gathering in the conference room windows. Word of the Mount Hood emergency had spread quickly, creating an awkward situation where they would be watching the capabilities of an aircraft they were planning to eliminate. The flight to Mount Hood took them across the spectacular Columbia River Gorge with its towering cliffs and cascading waterfalls. But Sarah's attention was focused on weather reports showing rapidly deteriorating conditions at high altitude. Wind speeds were increasing beyond normal operational limits, and a storm system was moving in from the Pacific that would make rescue operations impossible within hours. "Mount Hood Base, this is Life Flight 19, Sarah radioed to the Mountain Rescue Coordination Center. "Approaching Crater Rock area, requesting update on victim locations and ground conditions." "Life Flight 19, victims are located on the northeast face at approximately 10,200 feet elevation," came the response from Ground Commander Lisa Park. "Access is extremely limited due to rockslide debris. Ground rescue teams estimate 6 hours minimum to reach the location." Sarah studied the terrain below as they climbed toward the rescue site. Mount Hood's upper elevations were a savage landscape of exposed rock, glacial ice, and deadly drop-offs that challenged even the most experienced climbers. Landing anywhere near Crater Rock would require precision that existed at the absolute limits of helicopter flight capabilities. "There," Chung called out, pointing toward a cluster of brightly colored shapes on a narrow ledge. "I can see the emergency shelters." The rescue site was worse than Sarah had anticipated. The rockslide had created an unstable debris field that extended for several hundred yards, with victims scattered across multiple ledges connected by treacherous rock faces. Any rescue operation would require multiple approaches in conditions that were becoming increasingly dangerous. "Life Flight 19, be advised wind speeds at your altitude are approaching operational limits," warned Mount Hood Base. "Gusts up to 50 knots, increasing rapidly." Sarah acknowledged the warning while beginning her approach to the highest group of victims. The Huey bucked and rolled in the violent air currents, its mechanical flight controls requiring constant input to maintain stability. This was flying at its most demanding, a three-dimensional chess game where every decision carried life or death consequences. "First extraction point," she announced over the intercom. "I can hold position for maybe 90 seconds before wind conditions become unmanageable." Torres and Chun worked with practiced efficiency, rappelling down to the stranded hikers and beginning triage operations. The first victim was a 16-year-old boy with a compound leg fracture, conscious but in severe pain. The extraction required delicate work with the rescue basket, while Sarah fought to keep the helicopter stable. In air so turbulent, it felt like riding a mechanical bull. "Patient secured," Torres called out. Moving to the second group. The second extraction was more challenging, requiring Sarah to position the Huey against a near-vertical rock face while Chun descended to reach two hikers trapped on a narrow ledge. One was unconscious with a head injury, while the other had sustained internal injuries that required immediate medical attention. Wind speeds are increasing, Sarah reported to Mount Hood Base. I've got maybe 2 more extractions before conditions become impossible. What followed was a masterclass in extreme helicopter operations. Sarah pushed both herself and the Huey to their absolute limits, making approaches that would have been suicide in any other aircraft. The old helicopter's mechanical systems provided the kind of precise control needed for operations in violent air currents, while its powerful engines maintained performance at altitudes that left newer aircraft struggling. This is incredible, breathed Dr. Martinez over the radio from Portland General, where she was monitoring the rescue operation. I've never seen anything like this kind of flying. But the most challenging extraction was yet to come. The final group of victims was trapped on a ledge accessible only by flying directly into a notch between 2 rock formations, a maneuver that required threading the helicopter through a gap barely wider than its rotor disc, while fighting winds that were now gusting above 60 knots. I don't think we can reach them, Chun said, studying the approach through binoculars. That gap is too narrow, and the wind conditions are beyond anything I've ever seen. Sarah studied the terrain with the calculating eye of someone who had spent decades pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The approach would require flying closer to terrain than any safety manual would allow, using techniques that existed at the intersection of skill, instinct, and desperation. We can reach them, she said finally. But it'll require flying the Huey like it's never been flown before. What happened next became legendary in Pacific Northwest aviation circles. Sarah flew the 30-year-old helicopter into the rock formation like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, making constant micro-adjustments to keep the rotor blades clear of the canyon walls while fighting air currents that threatened to dash them against the rocks. The extraction took 12 minutes that felt like hours, with Sarah maintaining an impossible hover while Torres descended to reach the final victims. Teenage girl with spinal injuries and her hiking guide, who had remained with her despite his own serious wounds. Last patient secured, Torres announced as they climbed away from Mount Hood. All 12 victims were extracted successfully. The flight back to the valley was a blur of medical procedures and radio communications, with multiple hospitals coordinating to receive the injured hikers. Sarah flew with mechanical precision despite exhaustion that went bone deep, her hands steady on the controls as they descended through increasingly turbulent air. As they approached Riverside Medical Center, Sarah could see crowds gathered around. The helipad hospital staff, administrators, media representatives, and family members of the rescued hikers. Word of the Mount Hood rescue had spread throughout the medical community, creating a reception that resembled a homecoming parade. Outstanding work, Captain, Kane said as Sarah completed her post-flight procedures. 12 lives saved in conditions that grounded every other aircraft in the region. The governor's office has already called requesting details for a commendation ceremony. Sarah nodded her appreciation but remained focused on securing the Huey and ensuring all systems were properly shut down. The helicopter had performed flawlessly during the most demanding mission of her career, proving once again that age and sophistication weren't always synonymous. But the real surprise came 30 minutes later, when Dr. Hartman approached with an expression Sarah had never seen before, a mixture of awe, embarrassment, and genuine respect. "Captain Mitchell," Hartman began, "I owe you an apology. The board convened an emergency session after monitoring today's rescue operation. We've unanimously voted to not only retain your helicopter, but to authorize a complete modernization program." Sarah looked up from her maintenance checklist, unsure she'd heard correctly. Modernization program? New avionics, upgraded medical equipment, enhanced safety systems, Hartman explained. We're also authorizing funding for a second pilot to be trained on your aircraft and procedures. The board realizes we've been evaluating an irreplaceable asset using the wrong criteria. The announcement was stunning in its reversal of everything Sarah had expected. The institution that had been preparing to eliminate her helicopter was now committing to expand the program based on operational capabilities rather than insurance concerns. There's something else, Hartman continued. The Federal Aviation Administration has contacted us about documenting your modifications and procedures. They're interested in your innovations for potential adoption across the emergency medical services industry. As word of the board's decision spread through the hospital, Sarah found herself surrounded by colleagues who had spent years dismissing her work. Pilots who had mocked the flying Coffin now sought to understand its capabilities, while administrators who had worried about liability exposure now wanted to expand the program. Captain Mitchell, called out a voice from the crowd. Sarah turned to see Colonel Williams approaching with a group of people she didn't recognize. I'd like you to meet some colleagues from the Department of Homeland Security. They've been following your work and have a proposition. The conversation that followed revealed opportunities Sarah had never imagined. Her innovations with the Huey had attracted attention from federal agencies responsible for disaster response, who were interested in both her aircraft modifications and her operational techniques. We're developing a new emergency response program, explained Agent Rebecca Chen from DHS. High-altitude rescues, extreme weather operations, situations where conventional aircraft can't operate. Your work here has demonstrated capabilities we didn't know existed. The offer was both flattering and overwhelming, a chance to apply her skills on a national level, working with resources and support that dwarfed anything available at Riverside. But it would also mean leaving the hospital where she'd rebuilt her career and the helicopter that had become an extension of herself. I need time to consider all the options, Sarah said diplomatically. As the crowds gradually dispersed and evening settled over the Columbia River Valley, Sarah found herself alone with the Huey in the familiar quiet of Hangar 7. The helicopter sat silent and patient, its scarred fuselage reflecting the overhead lights like badges of honor earned through years of demanding service. Quite a day, observed Torres as she entered the hangar to collect equipment. 12 lives saved, complete vindication of everything you've built here, and job offers from the federal government. Not bad for someone who was about to be grounded this morning. Sarah smiled, feeling a contentment that had eluded her for years. The Mount Hood rescue had proven everything she'd believed about the value of experience, innovation, and refusing to accept conventional limitations. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that redemption was possible for those willing to work for it. What are you going to do about all these opportunities? Torres asked. Sarah looked at her helicopter, then toward the mountains where 12 people were alive because of decisions made under pressure. I'm going to keep flying, she said simply. Whether it's here, with the federal government, or somewhere else entirely, I'm going to keep doing what I was meant to do. The weeks following the Mount Hood rescue brought changes that Sarah could never have anticipated. The hospital's modernization program proceeded at lightning speed, with new avionics systems being integrated into the Huey's cockpit alongside her custom modifications. Engineers from Boeing and Bell Helicopter arrived to study her innovations, taking detailed measurements and photographs of systems that existed nowhere else in commercial aviation. This rotor blade modification alone increases lift capacity by 12%, marveled Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the aerospace engineer leading the documentation project. How did you calculate the pitch angle adjustments without computer modeling? Sarah looked up from calibrating the new navigation system, her hands still greasy from the morning's maintenance routine. Trial and error, mostly. Plus 30 years of feeling how helicopters respond to different configurations. What she didn't explain was that each modification had been born from specific missions, where standard configurations had proven inadequate. The rotor adjustments came from high-altitude rescues, where every pound of lift mattered. The engine modifications emerged from extended hover operations that pushed turbines beyond their design limits. Every innovation was written in the language of real-world necessity rather than theoretical optimization. The Federal Aviation Administration wants to fast-track certification of your modifications for commercial use, Reynolds continued. They're calling it the Mitchell Enhancement Package. Your techniques could revolutionize emergency medical services nationwide. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. 5 months ago, insurance companies had questioned whether her flying methods were too dangerous to allow. Now federal agencies wanted to make those same techniques the new standard for emergency aviation. Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos from the Coast Guard entered the hangar, carrying a briefcase that suggested official business. Captain Mitchell, I have authorization from Coast Guard headquarters to discuss a joint training program. We're interested in adapting your high-wind techniques for maritime rescues. The conversation that followed revealed how far word of Sarah's capabilities had spread through military and civilian aviation communities. The Mount Hood rescue had been recorded by multiple agencies, creating a training video that was being studied at flight schools from California to Maine. Your approach to the final extraction site violated every standard safety protocol, Santos explained, but it also demonstrated flying skills that our instructors didn't know were possible. We want to understand how you developed these techniques. Sarah had been asked this question dozens of times over the past weeks, and her answer remained consistent. You develop these skills by flying missions where failure isn't an option. Every technique I use was learned because someone's life depended on pushing beyond normal limitations. The truth was more complex than she usually admitted. Her innovations weren't just products of necessity. They were also expressions of a perfectionist personality that had driven her throughout her military career. The same obsessive attention to detail that had made her an exceptional test pilot had transformed an aging helicopter into something unprecedented in civilian aviation. We'd like to station you at Coast Guard Air Station Astoria for 6 months. Santos proposed. Joint operations, cross-training, development of standardized procedures for extreme conditions. Your salary would be supplemented by federal funds, and you'd maintain your position here at Riverside. Sarah considered the offer while continuing her work on the avionics integration. The Coast Guard operated in conditions that often exceeded even her experience oceanic rescues in hurricane-force winds, night operations and zero visibility. Missions where the margin between success and catastrophe measured in seconds rather than minutes. I'd need to bring my helicopter, she said. Finally, these techniques require specific aircraft capabilities that don't exist in standard configurations. Already arranged, Santos smiled. Coast Guard headquarters has authorized temporary certification of your aircraft for military operations. They're very interested in your power-to-weight modifications for high-altitude coastal rescues. As the formal discussions continued around her, Sarah reflected on the strange trajectory her career had taken. 6 months ago, she'd been fighting to keep her helicopter operational against institutional resistance. Now government agencies were competing for her expertise, treating her innovations as breakthrough technology rather than expensive eccentricities. The transformation extended beyond professional recognition. Hospital staff who had once dismissed her as the stubborn woman with the flying coffin now sought her advice on aviation matters. Medical personnel requested specific assignment to her flights, understanding that working with Sarah Mitchell meant participating in rescues that other crews couldn't attempt. Captain, called out David Chen as he approached with a tablet displaying flight schedules. We've got 3 news crews requesting interviews about the Mount Hood rescue. National Geographic wants to do a documentary about your helicopter modifications. Sarah shook her head. uncomfortable with media attention that focused on her personality rather than operational capabilities. Refer them to the hospital's public relations department. The story isn't about me, it's about what's possible when you refuse to accept limitations. But Chun persisted, understanding better than Sarah did how her story resonated with people beyond the aviation community. There's a group of young women from the Portland Aviation Academy who want to visit the hangar. They're calling you a role model for female pilots who want to push boundaries. The request stopped Sarah cold. Throughout her career, she'd focused on technical excellence rather than gender politics, believing that superior performance would speak louder than advocacy. But she was beginning to understand that her journey from discredited test pilot to national aviation expert carried meanings beyond her personal redemption. "Schedule the visit," she said finally. "But make it clear that this isn't about inspirational speeches. If they want to understand advanced helicopter operations, they need to be prepared for technical discussions." What Sarah didn't anticipate was how much the visit would affect her own perspective. The 12 young women who toured the hangar weren't just interested in her flying techniques. They wanted to understand how she'd overcome institutional resistance, bureaucratic obstacles, and professional setbacks that would have ended most careers. "How did you keep going when everyone said you were wrong?" asked Jennifer Park, a 17-year-old student pilot whose direct question cut through Sarah's usual technical explanations. Sarah paused in her demonstration of rotor blade modifications, considering how to answer honestly without dwelling on personal struggles. "You keep going because the work matters more than other people's opinions. Every technique I developed, every modification I made, was focused on saving lives that couldn't be saved any other way." "But weren't you angry?" pressed another student. "When they called your helicopter a flying coffin and tried to ground you?" "Anger is a luxury you can't afford when people's lives depend on your performance," Sarah replied. "I channeled that energy into becoming better at my job instead of fighting institutional politics." The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from aerodynamic theory to career resilience. By the end, Sarah realized she'd been as educated as the students, learning to articulate lessons she'd never consciously understood. Dr. Martinez approached as the students departed, her expression thoughtful. "You know, Captain, watching you work with those young women reminded me why your story matters beyond aviation circles. You've proven that expertise and determination can overcome any institutional bias. I've proven that good flying saves lives." Sarah corrected, "Everything else is just commentary." But privately, she was beginning to understand that her journey represented something larger than personal redemption. The woman who had hidden behind data screens for 5 years had become a symbol of resilience for people facing their own professional challenges. The recognition reached its culmination 6 months later when Captain Sarah Mitchell stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., testifying about innovations in emergency aviation that could save thousands of lives across the nation. Her 30-year-old Huey had become the prototype for a new generation of emergency response aircraft, while her techniques were being taught at flight schools throughout the country. "Captain Mitchell," said Committee Chairman Senator Robert Hayes, "your innovations have fundamentally changed how we approach emergency medical aviation. Can you explain to the committee how these breakthroughs emerged from what many considered an obsolete aircraft?" Sarah leaned toward the microphone, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had proven her worth under the most demanding conditions imaginable. "Senator, the aircraft wasn't obsolete, it was underutilized. Sometimes the most important innovations come from understanding existing technology better rather than constantly pursuing newer systems." The hearing room was packed with aviation professionals, federal agency representatives, and media covering what had become known as the Mitchell Doctrine, the principle that operational excellence trumped technological sophistication in critical situations. Your modifications to the Bell UH-1 have been adopted by emergency services in 12 states. Noted committee member Representative Lisa Chun. The Coast Guard reports a 30% improvement in rescue success rates using your techniques. How do you respond to critics who suggest these methods are too dangerous for widespread adoption? Every technique I've developed has been tested under real-world conditions where lives were at stake. Sarah responded. The only dangerous approach is limiting rescue capabilities based on theoretical safety concerns rather than actual operational requirements. But even as she testified before Congress, Sarah's thoughts kept returning to her apartment overlooking the Columbia River, where she could see the lights of Riverside Medical Center and remember the woman who had once hidden behind data screens and self-imposed limitations. The flying coffin had become exactly what she'd always known it could be, a guardian angel watching over everyone who needed rescuing. The helicopter they'd called a flying coffin had taught the world a simple truth, sometimes the most important. Capabilities can't be measured in computer specifications or insurance policies. Sometimes they can only be found in the hands of someone who refuses to accept that impossible means impossible. And in the quiet moments between missions, Sarah Mitchell finally understood that she had accomplished something more important than professional redemption. She had proven that the most powerful technology wasn't always the newest or most expensive. Sometimes it was just the oldest and most experienced, guided by hands that had learned to make the impossible look routine. The sky was waiting, and Sarah Mitchell was exactly where she belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.